Assalamu alaikum, welcome to DipPolSci program, and I am your host Tariq Khan. Viewers will discuss and explore Ukraine-Russia relations and the contemporary conflicts between both countries, and what are the role perspectives of neighboring regional countries on this issue, on this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So today, Professor Dr. Andreas Umland has joined us from Ukraine. You are senior analyst on international affairs. You are senior analyst at Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Dr. Andreas, thank you so much for joining the DipPolSci program, and you are most welcome. Doctor, how would you analyze the current situation, current relations between Russia and Ukraine, and in terms of security and economic perspectives? How would you analyze?
Well, as you know, the relationship is now very bad between Ukraine and Russia. Essentially, the two countries are at war for more than 7 years now, for actually almost 8 years already. The Russian attack on Ukraine started already during the Euromaidan revolution, or Revolution of Dignity, in February 2014. As you may know, it started with the annexation of Crimea, and then became a real war in eastern Ukraine after Crimea was annexed. And so it is no surprise that both the political and economic relations have deteriorated and now are very tense. The war is not any longer, or at least not for now, a hot war. It is what is sometimes called a low-intensity conflict. The last large battle was in February 2015 in DipPolSci, and after this last large battle, in which Ukraine lost a part of eastern, as a result of which Ukraine lost a part of eastern Ukraine. Since then, we have this so-called low-intensity conflict, but people are still dying. For instance, a couple of days ago, a Ukrainian soldier who was wounded in late December 2021 died in the hospital. So it's still a war. There's no peace. And now, of course, there are fears that the situation could escalate again. And about economic relations, there is actually not much to say anymore, because there's still some trade going on, because some of the Ukrainian companies are reliant on the Russian market, but the trade is minimal now. It has rapidly declined since 2014. Ukraine is still getting Russian gas, but oddly, this Russian gas is now not bought from Russia, but from European companies, from EU companies, and is those not any longer Ukrainian energy independence on Russia that we had until 2014. So for now, we have to actually just hope that the war will not escalate again, and will not perhaps even become a major openly interstate war. Currently, Russia is claiming that this is not a Russian-Ukrainian war, but allegedly a civil war in eastern Ukraine. But the evidence is that this is a pseudo-civil war, that the war in eastern Ukraine has been started by Russian irregulars, directed by the Russian state, and since then, since April 2014, the war has been financed and directed and basically conducted by Russia via its proxies in eastern Ukraine. So we have a very tense situation here, and now also very tense relations, not only between Russia and Ukraine, but also between Russia and the West, because the West, both the European Union and the United States, are supporting Ukraine, and Russia is unhappy about that. And there's a lot more to be said, but maybe I finish on this topic here.
Dr. Andreas, what are the factors? What do you think? What are the factors behind Ukraine-Russian conflict, and what would be the prospects for regional peace? How would you conclude?
Well, the factors and the prospects are closely linked and deliver an altogether sad picture, because I think the main factors here of this Russian war against Ukraine have actually not directly to do with Ukraine, but with the Russian domestic situation, and in particular with the authoritarian regime that Putin's government has become over the last 20 years. Putin came to power in relatively free elections in 2000 when he was first elected president. This was already a manipulated election, but there was some competition still there. But since 2000, since his first election as president, the regime has become authoritarian. And at the same time, the Ukrainian political system has become more democratic. It is not yet a fully developed liberal democracy, but it has now a relatively competitive multi-party system, relatively free media landscape, a vibrant civil society, and very obvious and very manifest political competition in parliament, on the TV station, in the TV stations, in the talk shows, and also on the streets, where there are frequent protests, meetings, demonstrations, and so on. And this difference between the Russian political system and the Ukrainian political system is basically, I would think, the main reason for the war, which is basically the fear in Russia that a successful Ukrainian democratic development could become a threat, a domestic threat for Russia, could become an example for ordinary Russians, and could then lead also to something like a color revolution, so-called color revolution in Russia. We had these revolutions in Georgia in 2003, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, and the so-called Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in 2005. And Russia is fearing something, or the Russian regime, or the power holders in the Russian regime are fearing something similar, and therefore they are pressing Ukraine, and they are trying to prevent successful Ukrainian development. Of course, the Russian rhetoric, the official Russian rhetoric, is very different. It's all about security and self-defense and the allegedly vulnerability of Russia. But we shouldn't forget that Russia has nuclear warheads stored on its territory, that the number of which is larger than the nuclear warheads of the US, Britain, and France taken together. So Russia is by far the largest nuclear power, nuclear weapons state of the world. It has also the delivery systems, submarines, bombers, missiles, cruise missiles, rockets, and whatnot. And it has also one of the three largest conventional armies of the world. It has a veto right in the UN Security Council. So Russia is one of the most secure countries, or perhaps even the most secure, militarily most secure country in the world. And therefore, this entire Russian talk about an alleged threat from the West, an alleged threat from Ukraine, is laughable in a way, and does not, correspond to the realities on the ground. But this is the Russian justification for the attack on Ukraine, and unfortunately, I think it will continue as long as Putin is in power.
Sir, as you have mentioned, United States of America and some Western states are standing with Russia on this matter. So, how do you view others neighboring regional countries or states and their role, perspectives on and stance on this towards Ukraine-Russia conflict? How would you analyze this?
Yeah, first maybe on the Western support for Ukraine. There is Western support for Ukraine, but we shouldn't forget that Ukraine is getting much less support from the West, from the European Union, and also from the United States than it wants. It once wanted much more from the European Union. It has gotten, for instance, an association agreement, but what it wants is a Europe agreement, like the East Central European countries in the 1990s that got, before they entered the European Union, so-called Europe agreements, which basically prepared these countries for accession to the European Union. That is what Ukraine wants from the European Union, and it has not gotten such an agreement from the European Union, but only an association agreement, which is less than Ukraine wants. A similar story goes for NATO. Ukraine has applied for NATO membership in 2008, and what it wanted in 2008, and since has always wanted, basically since 2008, is a membership action plan, a concrete process of entering NATO and membership of NATO. What it got in 2008 was, however, only an elusive promise that it will become a member of NATO. The same goes for Georgia, which also applied for membership. It also got the same sort of elusive promise in 2008. And neither Ukraine nor Georgia have until now received membership action plans. Similar stories could be said about foreign investment, about deliveries of weapons, about bilateral cooperation. So Ukraine is getting much less cooperation, both from the European Union and from the United States than it wants. Often the international comments on this whole situations are reverse and are actually misleading, in that people allege that NATO and the EU have enlargement plans, and that both the European Union and the United States are sort of intruding into Russia's sphere of influence. But what we have in fact here, and I'm speaking from Kyiv right now, is the exact opposite situation, that the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian parliament, all of the major Ukrainian political forces want much more support, much more cooperation, in fact, integration of Ukraine into Western organizations, and it is not getting yet, and is waiting for it already many years. So, for instance, since 1998, Ukraine has the aim of membership in the European Union as its official state goal formulated in writing, and has repeated it many times, and now it's in the constitution. The aim of entering both the European Union and NATO is a part of the Ukrainian constitution, and is supported by all major political forces in Ukraine. Regionally, here in Eastern Europe, and I'm speaking, as I said, from Kyiv, there is more support for Ukraine than from the West, than from Western Europe, and also I would say from North America. So countries like Poland, Lithuania, and recently also Turkey are supporting Ukraine to a larger degree than Western states. And there's now an organization called the Lublin Triangle, which unites Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania in a sort of alliance. There's now very intense bilateral cooperation between Ukraine and Turkey, also in the military technological sphere. So the other East European and Black Sea countries in the region here, they are seeing the importance of Ukraine for regional security and for a balance of power also in Eastern Europe and in the Black Sea region. And therefore, they are supporting, I think, for their own national interests, for their own reasons, they are supporting Ukraine in this confrontation with Russia, and now even Turkey is basically on the side of Ukraine. Turkey has also always condemned the annexation of Crimea, and is now in an informal, I would say, alliance with Ukraine, and is supporting Ukraine with weapons and with all sorts of cooperation schemes. So this is now not only a bilateral conflict between Ukraine and Russia, but it's a multilateral conflict. Moldova and Georgia have their own conflicts with Russia in Transnistria, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. Russia is also a part of the Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict, where it plays a very ambivalent role, I would say, supposedly a peacekeeper, but in fact rather as a balancer of, as a balancing power, not in a positive sense balancing, but rather balancing both countries so that the conflict around Karabakh keeps alive. So the Ukrainian-Russian conflict is by no means just a bilateral conflict, but is involving many more countries, and is not even the only conflict that Russia has with former post-Soviets, with former Soviet republics, with new post-Soviet independent states.
Sir, you have stated a little bit about nuclear energy. As you know, Ukraine has been dependent on Russia for its nuclear energy. So how do you view nuclear matters or nuclear issues of Ukraine? Why Ukraine is important for non-proliferation? Can you elaborate in more details about this stance?
Yes, I think the case of Ukraine, the history of the independent Ukrainian state in the last 30 years plays, I would say, a crucial role for the future of the non-proliferation regime, because what we've observed here is, what we are observing also here is a conflict between two signatories of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty signed in 1968. This is a large international treaty where most countries of the world are signatories, but it is a treaty that is unequal, as many of the listeners will probably know, in that 5 countries of the world are within this treaty about nuclear non-proliferation allowed to have nuclear weapons. And you probably know that these are Russia, the United States, China, France, and Great Britain. And one of these countries, Russia, as the successor of the Soviet Union, has now attacked an official non-nuclear weapon state under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that is extremely important because it puts the entire logic of the non-proliferation regime on its head. Because Russia attacked Ukraine because Ukraine does not have nuclear weapons, and Russia was able to avoid any external help, military help for Ukraine for the last almost 8 years, because the many friends that Ukraine has in Europe and beyond Europe are not helping militarily Ukraine because they are afraid of Russia, or more concretely, they are afraid of Russian nuclear weapons. That is the main reason why Ukraine is not getting help, why there are no European troops or American troops on Ukraine or Ukrainian soil and helping Ukraine in this confrontation with Russia. The reason here is that Russia has nuclear weapons and can destroy any enemy, and can in fact destroy the whole of humanity with its thousands of nuclear warheads. And that puts the entire logic of the non-proliferation regime on its head, because the non-proliferation regime, since the annexation of Crimea, has become an instrument for the official nuclear weapon, for for an official nuclear weapons state to increase its territory at the expense of a, surprise, surprise, official non-nuclear weapons state. So, and Ukraine, not only does Ukraine not have any nuclear weapons, but Ukraine is also forbidden explicitly by this fully ratified treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to obtain any nuclear weapons, to build any nuclear weapons, to develop any nuclear weapons, to have any nuclear weapons material. Ukraine is explicitly forbidden to do so, whereas Russia is explicitly allowed to do so. And that is, of course, very dangerous because it may have repercussions for the future of humanity that go far beyond Eastern Europe, and that will, so to say, teach a lesson to all sorts of politicians and state leaders around the world today and in the future. Because politicians in entirely other regions may want to be not as stupid as the Ukrainians and avoid having nuclear weapons, especially if they are in a conflict, in a potential territorial conflict with a neighboring state. And some politicians may actually decide that they want to be as smart as the Russians and obtain nuclear weapons in order to perhaps increase the territories of their states. So this is a very dangerous, I think, development. And as you may know, it is even a more bizarre development against the background that Ukraine once had nuclear weapons. Ukraine, in fact, was, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, the third largest nuclear weapon state of the world for a short period. It had more nuclear warheads than China, France, and Great Britain taken together. But Ukraine, against the background also of the Chernobyl catastrophe of 1986, decided in 1994 to give away not only a part or not only the larger part of its nuclear warheads, it decided to give away and give to Russia actually all of its nuclear weapons, all of its nuclear warheads, and become a fully non-nuclear weapon state, to become a full member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state. And now Ukraine has been punished for such naivety. And this punishment for adhering to international law, the punishment for following the logic of the non-proliferation regime, the punishment for Ukrainian pacifism has been losing territory and now being in a war with an official nuclear weapon state. And this is a very, I would say, risky situation, not only for Ukraine, not only for Eastern Europe, not only for Europe, but for the entire world, because it invites basically other countries around the world to rethink their non-nuclear status, to obtain nuclear weapons, not to be as stupid as the Ukrainians, and maybe to also obtain nuclear weapons to be as smart as the Russians, and to have nuclear weapons and then to increase your country's territory at the expense of perhaps a non-nuclear weapons state, in the same way that Russia has done this in 2014. So I think that is the larger significance and relevance of the Ukrainian case here, and it is something that so far has been underestimated by diplomats, experts, politicians around the world that do not see these risks. One should also not exclude that perhaps the building and operation of nuclear weapons could become in the future much less technologically complicated than it is now. Currently, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons is not only secured by international law and by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's also difficult because it's a complicated and costly process to produce a nuclear weapon and to build a nuclear missile or a nuclear bomb. But in the future, this may change. We are all witnessing every day, basically, technological breakthroughs, we may perhaps in 10 years be in a situation where you could build very relatively cheaply, relatively quickly, a nuclear weapon of your own, and then the Non-Proliferation Treaty will obtain entirely different meaning. But it has now been undermined. It has been fundamentally undermined with Russia's attack on Ukraine in 2014 and its war against Ukraine since 2014. And that creates a bad omen, I would say, for the future of international security.
Sir, what does Russia want from Ukraine, and what is the way to resolve the current conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and what kind of message would you like to deliver to Russian as well as Ukrainian political leadership?
Well, I'm rather pessimistic and skeptical about the prospects for peace as long as Vladimir Putin is in power. That is, I think, what many Eastern Europe experts would today say. Not only me. I think that is now has become an almost a commonplace that as long as Putin is in power, as long as his regime functions the way that it functions, there is very little prospect for creating lasting peace in Russian-Ukrainian relations. So that leaves for Ukraine the only option to strengthen its defense, to build alliances, to be as strong as possible, and to make it as costly for Russia as possible to escalate again. That is currently the only advice I could give to the Ukrainian leadership. But in fact, it's an entirely superfluous advice. That is also what the Ukrainian leadership, the Ukrainian experts, academics, diplomats, politicians think anyway. I'm not very original when I'm saying this here in Kiev. For Russia, I think there's little one could say to the current Russian leadership. One can only say to ordinary Russians is that this whole operation, the annexation of Crimea, the war against Ukraine, the adventures in Moldova, in Georgia, they are and will be costly. So Russia is the largest atomic weapons state of the world. It can basically do whatever it wants, but these actions, the confrontation with neighbors and the confrontation with the West, come at a cost. And one can only say if these confrontations and if the obtaining of additional territories and controlling other countries and other regions outside Russia is so important for Russians, and if they are ready to pay the heavy economic and financial costs for it, then there's very little we can talk about. But if you want to have a sort of a more successful country, a richer country, a better country for yourself and for your children and grandchildren, then Russia should become a normal nation state. It should, return to its borders. It should, it is not in danger. It is the most heavily armed country in a way of the world, and it does not have to fear any foreign intervention, and it should concentrate on its own development. And that is what I would say to ordinary Russians, that the last 8 years have been already quite costly for Russia. Ordinary Russians have felt it. Their purchasing power has declined. Russian economic growth has been muted. Basically, Russia has remained in a state of stagnation. The formal numbers look somewhat better, but in actual fact, the socioeconomic situation has stagnated or even declined for most Russians, and that will continue, and that will become worse if there's new escalation in Ukraine, and of course, especially if there's an escalation of relations with the West. So that is basically what I can say at this point. Things may change if the Russian leadership changes, and I think the the departure of Vladimir Putin will mean not only a leadership change, it will also lead, I think, to a regime change, because the current regime of Russia functions only with Putin at its helm. I don't think it's a long-term regime that will survive Putin. So then we will maybe get into an entirely different situation, and then perhaps we can actually return to earlier attempts to include Russia into the European integration process, as was attempted in the 1990s. But that will demand first a regime change in Russia.
Dr. Andreas, thank you so much for your time and thought-provoking, thoughtful analysis on Ukraine-Russia contemporary relations. Thank you so much again. Viewers, thank you so much and see you in the next episode. Till then, take care. Allah Hafiz.
Thank you very much, Tariq.